Well, hello, welcome back. Um, Today we're going to start talking about our third topic under the philosophy of love, which is love as motivated concern. So far, we've talked about two theories of love. We've talked about love as union, which is the view that love is or involves a desire for a kind of union between the lover and the beloved, right? So between the subject of love and the object of love. And we've talked about love as valuation, which is the view that love is a valuation of the object of love on the part of the subject of love, right? That love is a positive value judgment, the judgment that some object is good or beautiful, made on the part of some subject. Now we're moving on to a third kind of theory, which is love as concern. Okay? And this is the theory that love is concern for or care for or goodwill for some object. And you'll see that there's two different versions of this theory in the history of philosophy, two very important versions that have had a lot of influence. Um, One of them is that love is what I'm calling motivated concern, and the other is that love is unmotivated concern. Okay, so motivated concern is concern that is motivated by or that is justified by some judgment about the value of the object. Okay, so it involves valuation. Whereas unmotivated concern is concern that's extended to some object, even though it's not judged to be, valuable in any particular way. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about for this topic and for the next one is love as concern, and the idea that love is again a kind of care or kind of goodwill for some object. Okay, so here's what I want us to do today. We're going to be talking about love as motivated concern in the work of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. And so I'm going to start by giving you a little bit more about the ancient Greek context that's going to help you to understand some of what Aristotle says. That should take about, a third or so of the lecture. And then we're going to move on to discussing Aristotle's book, The Nicomachean Ethics, which is where the excerpt that you were supposed to read for today was taken from. So we're going to be reading for this topic a big excerpt from book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and then a very short excerpt from book 9. So today I'm going to introduce the background on the Nicomachean Ethics, and then I'm going to start talking about that excerpt from book 8. We'll talk about what Aristotle says about the nature of friendship, and then we're going to talk about the way he thinks friendship can be divided into different kinds. Okay, the way he thinks there are different kinds of friendship. And then next time, we're going to finish talking about the big excerpt from book 8, and we'll start talking about that short excerpt from book 9. Okay, before I move on to the historical context, though, I want to make a quick linguistic note about the concept of love that's at play here. I told you a few lectures ago, in the first lecture of this unit, that there are three different concepts of love that you find in the Western philosophical tradition, and that continue to have an influence on contemporary philosophy of love. And those three concepts are eros, philia, and agape. Eros, remember I told you, is usually translated as romantic love, sometimes romantic attraction, which is probably the better translation. Philia is usually translated as friendship or friendly love. Sometimes you'll see brotherly love. And then agape, which is quite difficult to translate. You don't find any kind of a uniform translation, but I usually say neighbor love. Okay, so it's eros, philia, and agape. Now, in book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics that we're talking about today, Aristotle is talking about philia. Okay, that is the word that he's using in the ancient Greek. Now, I pointed out philia is usually translated as friendly love. Okay, so it's the kind of love that you have within relations of friendship. And this includes the kinds of things that we would call friendships now. Okay, so philia includes like your pals, the people you hang out with, the people you engage in various kinds of activities with, the people you have shared interests with. Okay, these are your friends. These are people with whom you have relations of philia. So philia does include our friendships. Okay, it does, but it doesn't include just those. Okay, it's a lot broader than that. The scope of the relationships that it includes is a lot broader than just what we would typically call friendships. I think that one useful way for you to think about this is to say that it covers all of your friendly relations. Okay, when you have a friendly relation with someone, you have a bond of philia with them. Okay, that's how broad we're talking. So, for example, Aristotle does talk about philia between friends. Okay, but he also talks about philia between spouses. A husband and wife have a relationship of philia. He talks about philia between siblings. Brothers, sisters have relations of philia. Um, Similarly, parents and children have relations of philia. It's even broader than that. He talks about the philia between comrades in arms. Okay, members of the same army have a bond of philia, as well as philia between fellow citizens. And members of the same city or country typically have, or at least it's good for them to have, bonds of philia. Okay, so we're talking about something that is quite broad. So that's the first point I want to make about the language. When we're talking about philia, we're not just talking about friendship in the narrower sense. We're talking about all of your friendly relations. Another related point I want to make is that the word philia in ancient Greek can refer both to friendship in this broad sense and to friendly love. Okay, so in other words, it can refer both to the friendly relation you have with someone, right? So the friendship itself, and to the love there is within that relation, right? So the love you have for your friends. The word philia can be used to designate both of those. And so when Aristotle uses the word love in the text, usually that word is translating philia, okay? And when Aristotle talks about friendship in the text, usually that word is also translating philia, okay? And I'll try to point out when it's relevant that we're talking about uh, friendly love versus friendly relations. So that's everything I wanted to say about language. Now let's move on to the historical context. Again, we're still in the same historical context as we have been for the last few lectures. Aristotle was writing, maybe about 50 years after Plato was, something like that. And so we're still broadly in the same period. So everything that I told you about ancient Greek polytheism still applies. In fact, it's going to come back in the next lecture. Everything I told you about the status of women in ancient Greece still applies. I'm going to say a bit more about that today, and then it's going to come back in the next lecture. Okay, so keep that stuff in mind. But there's also a couple of other details. Well, really one big detail I want to go over with you, which is hierarchy. Now, I've already talked about the concept of a hierarchy in this class, but just to jog your memory, a hierarchy is any arrangement of objects, okay, of people, of things, of ideas, whatever, where some are considered to be higher and some are considered to be lower. Okay, so it's any arrangement, again, of people, things, ideas, where some are considered to be more important, more valuable, more worthy of respect, something like that. And others are considered to be less important, less valuable, less worthy of respect. Okay, that's what a hierarchy is. Now, what I want to talk about is a hierarchical society. And a hierarchical society is simply a society where some people are thought to be more important, more valuable, more worthy of respect than others. Okay, and this can be reflected in a couple different ways. It can be reflected in their having different moral statuses. Okay, people think that it's that different people need to be treated in different ways, even if it isn't reflected in the law. And another way that it can be reflected is in the law. Okay? When people have different legal statuses, right? In other words, when people have different legal rights. Um, so a society where there are slaves or serfs, for example, that's a hierarchical society where some people have different legal rights from others. And usually those people will also have different moral standing. People will think that it's okay to treat them in different ways. Now, modern Western societies are shockingly egalitarian. Okay, from a historical perspective, if you look at the history of the human species, and from a global perspective, if you look at all the possibilities there are around the world, we are very, very egalitarian societies where most of us think that everybody is in some sense equal, right? Everybody's interests, everybody's needs should have the same weight. Everybody should have the same rights. Now, ancient Greek society, in contrast, was not egalitarian at all. Okay? It was very hierarchical. And this is especially true of ancient Athenian society. Now, Aristotle was not from Athens, but he moved to Athens to go study with Plato, and then that's where he lived and wrote for the rest of his life. And so it's the context that's relevant to us. Aristotle was writing in ancient Athens, which was, again, a very hierarchical society where some people had um, more rights, more legal protections, and other people had fewer rights, fewer legal protections. Okay, so ancient Greek society was very hierarchical in a couple of ways. For one, there were social and political hierarchies between the classes. So I've got an illustration here on the slide where you can see the way in which Athenian society was divided. So you can see here that there are four classes of people, and each of them have different rights and different kinds of legal statuses. Okay, so at the very top, you have the Athenians, which is to say the citizens, okay, the Athenian citizens. These are propertied men, men who own land, and they were the upper class. They could vote, and nobody else could vote. Okay? They're the only people who could vote, and they tended to work in government, education, in the arts as well. Okay, they didn't do any manual labor really. And then the next class down is the medics. Medics were resident immigrants. Okay, so foreigners who had moved to Athens to work, and they were generally the middle class. They couldn't vote, but they did have a lot of legal protections. Okay, and they tended to work in the skilled trades or to be merchants. Then in the next class down, you had the freedmen, and these were simply freed slaves. Okay, so this was your lower class. These people couldn't vote, but they did have legal protections, like the medics. But they tended to work not as skilled workers, but as unskilled laborers. Okay, they would do building, stuff like that. And then at the very bottom, an enormous portion of the population were slaves. And slaves basically had the status of property. They had virtually no legal protections at all. Um, and they did most of the work in Athens. So there was a hierarchy between the classes. And then on the other hand, there was a hierarchy between the sexes. Okay, we've already seen this a little bit. Ancient Athens was a sex-segregated society. Women were largely confined to the household. They didn't have much public presence, and they had very few legal protections. Okay, they couldn't own property, for example. So what you have in both of these cases is a social hierarchy and a political hierarchy. Okay, so it's a social hierarchy because different people have different social standings. Different things are expected of them, and they're treated in different ways. And it's a legal hierarchy because that comes with different rights. Okay, and it's worth noting that once you were part of a particular class, usually you were part of that class for life. Okay, slaves could get freed, but for the most part, if you were born a medic, you were born a merchant to a family of medics, well, you're going to be a merchant your whole life. You were born a skilled laborer, like a medic, well, you're going to be a skilled laborer for life. You were born to the upper class, your parents are politicians, well, you're going to be an upper class citizen, probably a politician as well. Okay, so you were generally speaking in your position for life. Now, in addition to this, Athenians, and in fact, most human beings at most points in human history thought that there was a cosmic hierarchy. Okay, they thought that it was just in the nature of things that some things are higher, more important, more worthy of respect than others. Okay, and they thought that their social and political orders, their social and political hierarchies, simply reflected this cosmic or this natural order. Okay, so of course, at the top of the cosmic hierarchy, there's the gods, right? They're what is highest, most important, most worthy of respect. And then below that, there's human beings. And then below that, there's non-human nature, right? Animals, plants, minerals, and so on. And then again, within human beings, there's a hierarchy between men and women, and then a hierarchy between adults and children, right? And the idea is that these hierarchies, although they're reflected in the social order, ultimately are grounded in the cosmos, in nature, in the way things are. And what's important for our purposes is that your place in the hierarchy was thought to dictate what was right or appropriate for you to do, right? It dictates your social role, and how you should act and what you should do and what kinds of things were appropriate. So they thought that these different social roles were to be associated with different behaviors. Okay. This brings us to the second thing I want to talk to you about, which is really the same thing, very closely related, which is what I'm calling the Delphic maxim. A maxim, if you don't know, is simply a principle, okay, or a saying, something like that. And there was a popular saying in ancient Greece, which was "Gnauthi seaton," which I just absolutely butchered, I'm sure. If you speak Greek, please don't email me to tell me how badly I butchered that. But anyway, there was this saying, which was "know thyself," and know yourself. This was uh, inscribed. This saying, besides just being a popular saying, was also inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi in Athens. Okay, and this is why I'm calling it, and some people call it, the Delphic maxim. Um, Now, this is the kind of thing that you might say to someone now, right? Oh, you got to know yourself. The thing is, what this meant, what this was understood to mean, is very different from what we would typically understand it to mean, right? If you come to me for advice and I say to you, you got to know yourself, what I probably mean is something like you got to know your preferences, you got to know what your strengths and weaknesses are, you got to think about like where you want to be in 10 years. You got to know this about yourself. This is not what the ancient Athenians understood by this. Okay, it's important not to get it mixed up. Um, what they meant was you got to know where you stand socially. Okay, it means first and foremost, know your place, right? Know where you belong in um, this social, political, cosmic hierarchy. Know where you belong and act accordingly. Okay, so it was thought, and certainly Aristotle thought, that the same virtues are good for everyone. Okay, um, whether you're a citizen or a medic or a freedman or a slave, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're even an adult or a child, the same virtues are good. Courage is good, temperance is good, generosity is good, honesty is good, industriousness is good, and so on and so forth. Right? Those things are good, no matter who you are, of course. The difference, though, or the thing is that those same virtues are going to require different behaviors depending on your social role. Okay. So, what honesty requires of a citizen is not necessarily going to be what honesty requires of a slave. What courage requires of a man is not necessarily going to be what courage requires of a woman, right? So even though they all have the same virtues, and we're going to talk a bunch about virtue in this lecture and how it was understood, even though they all have the same virtues, these are associated with different kinds of behaviors depending on your social role. Okay, so for example, if you were a citizen, right, a member of the upper class, to know yourself, to know your place, and to act accordingly would have meant, among other things, not doing things that were befitting of slaves, right? And conversely, if you were a slave who knew themselves, um, well, this would involve not going around acting like you were a citizen, right? It has to do with knowing your place in the hierarchy. Um, and the reason that I point this out is that it really helps illuminate a lot of Aristotle's ethics. I think that if you study Aristotle's ethics without keeping this context in mind, of course, it can still be interesting. You can still find things that are true in there, but you don't really understand what he meant by it. Okay. And I think this is a common problem when people read Aristotle's ethics is incorrectly abstracting it away from the social roles that he was talking about. So that's everything I want to say about the historical context. Now let's move on to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which again is the book that the excerpts you were supposed to read for this topic were taken from. First, a bit of background about Aristotle himself. Aristotle is, along with Plato, one of the most important, one of the most influential philosophers in the Western tradition. As I already told you, he studied at Plato's academy, and he went to Athens to study at Plato's school. The thing is, though, that we don't know how well he knew Plato himself. Okay, there's about a 40-year age gap between Plato and Aristotle, and all we know is that Aristotle went to Plato's school. We don't know if he ever attended classes with him. We don't know if they had any kind of a personal relationship. And in fact, since there was such an age gap between them, it's very unlikely that they would have had much of a relationship. What we do know is that Aristotle had major philosophical disagreements with Plato, as well as with Plato's entire school of thought. Okay, in particular, we know that he disagreed with the theory of forms that we talked a little bit about last time. And so he ended up founding his own school, his own separate school, the Lyceum, elsewhere in Athens. He's also known, as you can see on the slide here, for tutoring Alexander the Great. Right? So when Alexander the Great was a child, Aristotle was his tutor. Now, Aristotle, like Plato, wrote an absolutely huge amount, quite a bit more actually, and on several topics. Okay, if you look at the complete works of Aristotle, There's treatises in there about ethics, about politics, about metaphysics, about logic, and even about things that we would now consider to be part of science, like physics, biology, and cosmology. Um, and again, unlike Plato, he wrote treatises, not dialogues, right? He wrote book-length essays defending some position. It's also worth noting that he had an enormous influence on both Christian and Islamic thought, especially during the Middle Ages. Okay, during the Middle Ages, both Christian philosophy and Muslim philosophy was very, very Aristotelian. In fact, when we get to Thomas Aquinas, who's a Christian philosopher, in our next topic, you'll see he often refers to the philosopher, right? He says, the philosopher says this, the philosopher says that. He's talking about Aristotle, okay? That's how much influence Aristotle had on medieval philosophy, is a lot of people just talked about him as if he was the spokesman for philosophy, right? Whatever Aristotle says, well, that's got to be right, right? You see this all over the place in medieval philosophy. Now let's talk about the Nicomachean Ethics, which is Aristotle's most important treatise on the subject of ethics. Okay, ethics, as we saw, is the study of what's good and bad, right and wrong. But Aristotle understood the subject of ethics in a much more narrow way. He understood ethics as the science of the good for human life. Okay? In other words, it's the study of what a good human life consists in. That's what his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, is trying to discover. What does a good human life consist in? What is it to live a good human life? To understand what Aristotle says about this, I'll have to say a few words about what might be his most important, or at least his most influential idea, which is that all natural beings, or maybe I should say all living beings, have a built-in telos. Okay, the word telos is an ancient Greek word that means a purpose or function. Okay, so Aristotle's idea is that all living beings, whether you're talking about a human being, a non-human animal, a plant, or a fungus, every living being has a built-in purpose or function. Um, it has by nature a certain purpose or function, right? There's a purpose or function built into the kind of thing that it is, into its nature. And to perform that function or to accomplish that purpose and to do it well, to do it excellently, that is its good. So for any being, to have a good life is to do the things that accord with its nature, right, with its natural purposes or its natural functions, and to do them excellently. That's what a good life consists in. But now you might ask, okay, well, how do we know what the natural purpose or natural function of a being is? And according to Aristotle, well, by looking at its internal constitution, right? How is it made up? What are its parts? And what do they allow that being to do? So for example, if you look at a bee, well, it is made up, it is constituted in such a way as to do bee things, right? It is constituted in order to be able to extract pollen from flowers and live in a hive and so on. Similarly, you look at beavers, well, it is constituted in a way to be able to cut down trees and so on, right? And so to figure out what a being's purpose is, you have to look at what it's like, right? How it's internally constituted. And so then you can ask, all right, what is the purpose of human beings? Well, again, you have to look at how we are constituted, right? What is our nature? What are we like? And according to Aristotle, the main feature that distinguishes human beings from other animals, the main feature that's important that's relevant to understanding what we're constituted to do, and so what our natural purpose or function is our ability to reason. Right? Human beings surpass all other animals by far in their ability to reason. And so it must be that our internal purpose is, of course, to survive and reproduce. That's a purpose that's shared by all living beings. But to do it, to succeed at doing it through the use of reason. And so for Aristotle, a good human life is a life under the direction of reason. Okay, so very early on in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that the purpose of human beings, that the telos of human beings, is activity of the soul in accordance with reason. And when we live in accordance with reason, we are living a good human life. We're living a life that is suited to our nature, that accords with our natural purposes or functions. Now, how do we live in accordance with reason? Well, according to Aristotle, the main way, the most important way, is by developing virtues. Okay. A life lived according to virtue for Aristotle is a life lived in accordance with reason. And so it is a good human life. Okay. It is a life that accords with human beings' natural purposes. To shed a bit of light on this, I should say a little bit more about the virtues. So, what's a virtue? Well, a virtue is simply a character trait that's judged to be good. Okay, so if it's a character trait and it's good, it's a virtue. Um, and a virtue is opposed to a vice. Okay, so a vice is a character trait that is bad. Now, an important point to make here is that character traits are dispositions, right? To have a certain character trait isn't to act in a particular way, like right now on this occasion, nor is it to feel in a particular way right now on this occasion. Instead, to have a character trait is to have a general disposition to act and to feel in certain ways in certain kinds of situations, right? Or on certain kinds of occasions. So, for example, if I'm an impatient person, if one of my character traits is that I'm impatient, that doesn't mean that I'm feeling angry or irritable now, nor does it mean that I'm, yelling at someone now. It just means that I have a general disposition to feel angry or irritated or to yell at people in certain kinds of situations. And it's a disposition. Um, and now, since virtues are character traits, well, it follows that virtues are dispositions. Right? Virtues are tendencies to act and to feel in certain ways. So, for example, for Aristotle, courage is not the disposition to just charge into battle and put yourself in dangerous situations for no good reason, right? Nor is it the disposition not to feel fear no matter what happens. That would be recklessness. That would be a vice. Instead, according to Aristotle, to be courageous is to have the disposition to put yourself in dangerous situations when appropriate, right? When it is the right thing to do. Similarly, to be courageous is to have the disposition to feel fear when it is appropriate, when it is the right thing to do. Okay? When reason would dictate that you feel fear or that you stand your ground. So, in this way, to have a virtue for Aristotle is to bring your emotions and your desires, and so your actions, under reason. Okay, that's how he thinks of what a virtue is. So that because your emotions and your desires and your actions have been shaped by reason, you will perform the right action. Right? You will perform the right action at the right time, in the right way, to the right extent, toward the right people, and so on and so forth. You will see exactly what is appropriate, and you will do that. Okay? That's how Aristotle understands virtue. And according to Aristotle, that is a good human life, right? That is a life lived in accordance with our nature as human beings, with our nature as rational beings. Okay, so that's all I want to tell you about Aristotle's ethics and his treatment of the good of human life and of the virtues. Now let's move on to his account of friendship, okay? Because it's in the context of a discussion of what a good human life consists in the Nicomachean Ethics, that he broaches the topic of friendship. Here's a quote explaining why. Okay, so at the very beginning of Book 8, the first excerpt that you were supposed to read, Aristotle explains how friendship fits into an account of a good life. So he says, the next step that is after discussing virtue and vice, the next step should be a discussion of friendship, since it is a virtue or involves virtue and is an absolute necessity in life. Okay, so here's how this is going to fit into this account. We're talking about a life of virtue, and he's saying friendship involves virtue in some way. Okay, either it is a virtue or it involves virtue, and it's going to turn out that he's going to say it involves virtue. And besides that, he says, it is an absolute necessity in a human life. No one, he says, would choose to live without friends, even if he had all the other goods. Okay, so no one would choose to live without relations of philia, relations with other people, even if we had all the other goods. And not only is it necessary, he says, but it's noble. We praise those who love their friends, and having many friends seems to be something noble. Again, we think that the same people are good and are friends. Okay? Now, if I'm going to explain what he's saying in this passage, um, I think I should first introduce some terminology. Okay. He's saying that friendship is good. But when you say that something is good, you might mean two different things. You might be saying that it's instrumentally good, or you might be saying that it's intrinsically good. So I'm going to distinguish between these two concepts so that we can better understand what Aristotle is saying in this passage. So to say that something is instrumentally good is to say that it's good for the sake of something else. Okay, it's good because it gets you something else. Another way to put the same point is to say that it's good as a means to some end, right? As a means, as a way of getting or a way of achieving some goal. So to illustrate, probably the best example of something that's instrumentally good is money, right? Nobody thinks that money is good for its own sake. Money is just pieces of paper. If you think that money is good, and presumably you do, it's because you think it's instrumentally good, right? It's good because it gets you things. So money is good, but instrumentally so. In contrast, to say that something is intrinsically good is to say that it's good for its own sake, right? It's good as an end, as a goal, something to pursue in and of itself, independently of anything else it can get you. Okay. This, of course, is a big question in ethics. What things are intrinsically good? Some people think it's only pleasure. Some people think it's nothing. But Aristotle, we've seen already, his answer is uh, living according to your nature in an excellent way. Okay, he thinks that that is what a good life consists in. There's no further question about what that's good for. That's just good intrinsically. And everything else you do, right? Getting a car, getting a job, getting your diploma, making money, everything else you do so that you can live according to your nature excellently, so that you can have a good life. So that's the distinction between instrumental and intrinsic goodness. Okay, it's the distinction between something being good for the sake of something else and something's being good for its own sake. Now let's go back to the quotation from Aristotle that we were just talking about. So what I think Aristotle is saying in this passage is that friendship, so philia, in this broad sense of friendly relations that we discussed, is both instrumentally good and intrinsically good. Okay, so if you look at this first paragraph here, he says that friendship is an absolute necessity in life. In other words, it's necessary to get you a good life. Right? And it's going to turn out what he means by that is it's necessary to get you certain things that are part of a good life. So he gives a few examples of this. First and foremost, the most important is that friendship enables virtuous behaviors. Okay, remember, a good life, according to Aristotle, is a life lived according to virtue. And you can't act virtuously without other people, right? You can't display your generosity without other people. You can't act courageously without other people. These are all things that require other people around you. So if you don't have, a wife or husband or children or fellow citizens or comrades in arms or whatever, you cannot live a virtuous life. So that's the one of the main ways he says friendship is a necessity. And one of the main ways it's instrumentally good is that it allows you to exercise virtue. Now, in addition to that, Aristotle says friendship is good because it provides you with support. Okay, in both good times and in bad times, we need support. There are various ways in which we need the help of others. So in good times, for example, I might have all kinds of goods that are important to me, a family, a house, things like that. And I can't protect that alone. I need other people, right? At the very least, I need a society of fellow citizens who are willing to uphold some laws with me. And I might need more than that. I might need friends who are willing to fight off attackers with me, right? In bad times, I need support because I'm lacking goods. And so I need other people to let me use theirs, to lend me theirs, to help me find a job, things like this, right? So whether we're having a good time or a bad time, we need other people around us. So that's another reason why friendship is instrumentally good, right? It gets us the help that we need, the support that we need. And then to this, Aristotle adds, friendship holds societies and families together. So this is another aspect of the idea of living according to our nature. Human beings are social animals, right? We live in social units at the lowest level in families and then higher up in cities, in countries. We live in these kinds of social networks, and we need to live in these kinds of social networks, right? You and I cannot provide for ourselves without other people. We need vast, very complicated networks of people to get us the food that we need and clean water and healthcare and all these kinds of things that we take for granted. Um, and Aristotle says bonds of friendship, right? Bonds of philia keep all those things together, hold all those things together. And so it turns out bonds of philia are necessary for human survival. Right? So this is another way in which philia is instrumentally good. It keeps together the societies, the social units, families, cities, countries, whatever, that we need in order to survive. So friendship, Aristotle is saying, philia, is instrumentally good. But he's also saying, or at least he seems to be saying, that it's also intrinsically good. Okay, so if you look at this second paragraph, he says it's not just necessary, but it's also noble, right? In and of itself, it's noble or good to have friends. It's praiseworthy in and of itself. In other words, what I think he's saying, what he seems to be saying, is that it would be good to have friends, even if they didn't give you these kinds of benefits, right? These kinds of instrumental benefits. Why? Well, I think the idea is this is just part of what it is to live a good human life, right? Part of what it is to live a life in accordance with human nature and to live that kind of life well is to have bonds of philia. Again, we're social animals, much like bees and like ants. Human life is life with other people. And so if you're living that kind of life and you're living it well, you're going to have bonds of philia. Okay? Those are just involved in what it is to live a social life well. Okay, so that's how Aristotle thinks a discussion of friendship, of philia, fits into a discussion about the good life. And that's why he thinks it's important to talk about friendship in a discussion about the good life. But then we might want to ask, okay, what is that? Right? This is the question we philosophers love to ask. You're talking about friendship, about philia, about friendly relations. What are you talking about? What is that? Here is what Aristotle says about it. He says, people say that we ought to wish good things to a friend for his own sake. People describe those who do wish good things in this way, when the wish is not reciprocated, as having goodwill. For goodwill is said to count as friendship only when it's reciprocated. And then he adds, perhaps we should add, and when it does not go unrecognized. For how could anyone call them friends when they're unaware of their attitude to one another? So they must have goodwill to each other, wish good things to each other for one of the reasons given, and not be unaware of it. Okay. Now, here he says, for one of the reasons given, we'll come back to that. Okay. There he's talking about the reasons for loving someone. In other words, the bases of love, right? Or the reasons for being friends with someone or the bases of friendship. We'll come back to that in a moment. But first, I want to concentrate on the nature of friendship. Okay. Here, Aristotle is saying what friendship is. And he's saying that there are three components to friendship. Now, I strongly encourage you to stop here for a moment, pause, read this slowly, think about it, and see if you can identify what the three components are. Okay, because he's saying the nature of friendship is such that there are three things involved in it. Okay? These three things have to be there for it to be a friendship. What are they? Okay, so hopefully you've thought about that. Here is a diagram to help us illustrate what these components are. So on the left-hand side, we have this Greek woman. For the sake of a name, let's call her Helen, which is a good ancient Greek name. On the right-hand side, we have another Greek woman. Again, for the sake of a name, let's call her Penelope, which is also an ancient Greek name. So now let's ask, under what conditions Helen and Penelope would be friends? And what would be required for them to count as friends? Well, according to Aristotle, in that passage we just read, one of the things that's required is goodwill. And by goodwill here, you can just understand concern or care. Okay? To have goodwill or to have concern, to have care for someone is to have a disposition to wish them well and to do good for them, right? Um, and this seems pretty obvious. Imagine that Helen didn't have any goodwill for Penelope. Okay? She had no disposition at all to go out of her way to help her or even to wish what is good for her. Would they be friends? Um, Presumably not. Okay, Aristotle says no, under those conditions, these would not be friends. But now a question that arises is that enough? Is that all that's required? Is it simply the case that if Helen has goodwill for Penelope, then they're friends? I hope you can see that the answer here is no, right? So imagine, for example, that Helen has goodwill for Penelope, but Penelope has no goodwill for Helen, or that Penelope doesn't even know that Helen exists. Okay, so maybe Penelope is a famous actress, and Helen has gone to a couple of her plays, and she has plenty of goodwill for her, but Penelope has never met her and does not even know that Helen exists. Under that conditions, it's very clear, I hope, that they would not be friends. So there's a second component that Aristotle lists in that passage, which is reciprocation. Okay, the goodwill has to be reciprocated. In other words, it has to go both ways. So Helen has to have goodwill for Penelope, and Penelope has to have goodwill for Helen. Right? So there are two relations of goodwill here. One where Helen is the subject and Penelope the object, and one where Penelope is the subject and Helen is the object. Okay, so there has to be two relations of goodwill for it to be friendship. But now we can ask again, okay, is that enough to count as friendship? If Helen has goodwill for Penelope and Penelope has goodwill for Helen, does that mean that they're friends? Again, I hope you can see that the answer is no, right? It may well be that Helen has a disposition to do good for Penelope, to help her if the need should arise, and that Penelope has a disposition to do good for Helen and to help her and whatever, but that neither of them knows it, right? So imagine, for example, again, that Penelope is a famous actress, and Helen has seen her play and really liked her, and now has a disposition to wish her well and to do what is good for her, and that Helen is a nobleman's wife, and that Penelope has heard about her through some friends and thought she was great, admired what she heard about her, and now has a disposition to, to wish her well and to help her out, but neither of them is aware of it, right? Neither of them knows that the other has goodwill for her because they've never met. Under those conditions, we would certainly not say, oh, they're friends, right? They don't even know each other. And so Aristotle says there's a third component, which is mutual recognition, right? There has to be goodwill or care or concern. That goodwill or care or concern has to go both ways, and both parties have to be aware of it. And under those conditions, Aristotle says, you have a friendship. Okay? So friendship is, according to Aristotle, mutually recognized, reciprocal goodwill. That's what it is. That is the essence of friendship, right? The essence of something is what makes it what it is. Anything is a relation of friendship if it includes these three components: goodwill, reciprocation of that goodwill, and then mutual recognition of that reciprocated goodwill. Okay? Any relation of friendship, any friendly relation at all, has those three components. And anything that has those three components is a friendly relation. And that's what Aristotle is saying. That's what friendship consists in. That is, again, the essence of friendship. Now, Aristotle says a lot of other things about what friendship is and what it usually involves. I'm not going to go over everything. I'll let you read some of that on your own. But I do want to go over one thing in particular, which is that, according to Aristotle, the characteristic activity of philia, right, the activity that characterizes people who are in a friendly relation with one another, is to confer benefits on each other. And that's what friends do. They confer benefits on each other. And this, of course, makes sense because he's defining friendship as a relation of goodwill, right? As a relation of care or concern. And as we've seen, goodwill just is a disposition to wish another person well and to do good things for them, right? It's a disposition to confer benefits on someone. And so it makes sense that this would be the characteristic activity of a friendship. Now, for this reason, Aristotle says that nothing is so characteristic of friends as living together, right? It is typical of friends to live together. Now, don't get the wrong idea here. He's not saying that what friends typically do is buy a house together or become roommates. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that it's typical of friends to share a life, right? That is usually part of what it is to be a friend, is to share your life with someone. That is, spend time with someone, do activities with them, get to know them, that kind of thing. And the reason for this is those are the conditions under which you can confer benefits on someone, right? You can't be friends with someone who you don't spend any time with or you don't see ever, since then you can't participate in the characteristic activity of friendship, which is to confer benefits on them. Okay? So for this reason, Aristotle says that distance, that living apart, if it lasts too long, usually dissolves a friendship, right? Your friendship can survive absences, but if that absence is too long, then you no longer share a life. You can't engage in the characteristic activity of friendship, right, of conferring benefits on each other, and then your friendship just kind of withers away. Okay, so that's everything I want to say about the nature of friendship, right, or about what friendship is according to Aristotle. Now I'd like just briefly to talk about the different kinds of friendship that Aristotle distinguishes between. So here's what he says. He says, it seems that not everything is loved, but only what is worthy of love. Okay, so the word love there is philia. It's the kind of love you have within friendly relations. It's friendly love. And he says that you don't have that kind of friendly love for everything or for everyone, but only for what is worthy of that kind of love. Okay, well, what is worthy of friendly love? He says, well, three things: good things, pleasant things, and useful things. Okay, what is good, what is pleasant, what is useful? That is what is worthy of philia. This means that there are three reasons, or in our terminology, that there are three bases for loving something, right? You extend your friendly love, your philia, to an object that is good, pleasant, or useful because it is good, pleasant, or useful. Now, to this he adds, since these reasons differ from one another, so do the forms of affection and friendship. Okay, so he says there are three species, or three types, or three kinds of friendship, equal in number to the objects worthy of it. Okay, so there are three kinds of objects that are worthy of your friendship. For each one, you extend your friendship on a different basis. So you extend it to an object that is good because it's good, an object that's pleasant because it's pleasant, an object that's useful because it's useful. And each of these corresponds to a different kind of friendship, according to Aristotle. Okay, so how should you understand this? Well, I think an easy way to understand this is he's saying that the basis of philia is always what is good. Okay, here you have an echo of Plato, of course, but I think he's saying that what is worthy of philia is always what is good. But as we saw, for something to be good can mean a couple different things. It can mean that it's instrumentally good, or it can mean that it's intrinsically good. And so when you extend your love, your friendly love to someone, it might be because they're intrinsically good. Okay, and that's why he says good there as the first one. He means intrinsically good. Or it might be because they're instrumentally good in two ways, either because they're pleasant to you or because they're useful to you. Okay, I think that's probably the best way to read what he means there, that he's saying you extend your friendship to someone either because they're just intrinsically good, which of course for Aristotle will mean because they're virtuous, right? Or because they're instrumentally good, because they give you pleasure or do various things for you that are useful. Okay, let's illustrate. Now here is again our handy diagram with Helen and Penelope. Now suppose that Helen and Penelope meet for the first time and they really admire each other. Okay, so suppose that Helen admires how Penelope handles adversity. She admires her resolve, her determination. And Penelope admires Helen's courage and her generosity. Okay, so here, each of them admires the other's character, their virtues. Now, if Helen extends goodwill to Penelope and Penelope extends goodwill to Helen, the reason for that goodwill, the basis, is that they recognize each other's goodness. Right? Or again, for Aristotle, this is going to mean each other's virtue, their intrinsic goodness, the fact that they are good people intrinsically, that they have a good character traits. Now, in this case, this is one type of friendship. It's what Aristotle calls a friendship of virtue. Okay, sometimes you'll see friendship of character. Sometimes you'll just see perfect friendship or true friendship. Okay, sometimes Aristotle calls this a true friendship, but it's a friendship that is based on virtue. Now, suppose instead that Helen and Penelope meet for the first time. Say they're at a social gathering, and they find each other very pleasant. So suppose that Helen finds Penelope very fun to hang out with. Okay, when they're at the social gathering, they just have a really good time. And similarly, Penelope finds Helen very fun to hang out with. They just have a very good time together. And for this reason, they extend goodwill to each other. Okay? They come to care for each other or have concern for each other. So this is what Aristotle calls a friendship of pleasure. And in this case, they extend goodwill to each other because they find each other, or because they are instrumentally good for each other. Okay, so Penelope gives something to Helen, namely pleasure. Helen finds it pleasant to be around her. And similarly, Helen gives something to Penelope, again, pleasure. Okay, and so in friendships of pleasure, the goodness on the basis of which you extend your friendship is an instrumental goodness. And now, for a third scenario, suppose that Helen and Penelope meet for the first time because they're new neighbors. Penelope helps Helen out. You know, she lends her stuff, maybe watches her kids. And Helen helps Penelope out. Maybe she gives her rides to the temple in her husband's wagon. Okay, right? Maybe her and her husband go to the temple at a time that's convenient, and they let Penelope tag along because it's easier that way. Well, in this case, the reason they extend goodwill to each other, if they do, is that they find each other useful, right? Each of them does things for the other. And this is what Aristotle calls a friendship of utility. Okay. Again, here the goodwill is extended to, like Helen extends goodwill to Penelope and vice versa because of instrumental goodness. Right? Penelope is instrumentally good for Helen, and Helen is instrumentally good for Penelope. Okay, so in a friendship of utility, as in a friendship of pleasure, the goodness there is instrumental. Now I'll point out, of course, you can mix and match. Okay, so Helen might be friends with Penelope because she finds her pleasant, while Penelope is friends with Helen because she finds her useful, or vice versa, or whatever combination. But you've got three different bases for extending goodwill for someone to someone, and these correspond to three different kinds of friendship: friendship of virtue, friendship of pleasure, friendship of utility. Okay, so that's everything I want to say about the nature of friendship and the kinds of friendship in Aristotle. Now, there's a lot more to say about the kinds of friendship, by the way. Aristotle says a lot more about how he thinks they differ, as well as which ones he thinks are better and why. Okay, we'll talk about that next time. For now, though, I want to leave you with a question, which is the following. In a friendship of virtue, in what Aristotle calls a true friendship, where one person extends goodwill to another because they admire their virtue, admire their character, and vice versa. In that kind of friendship, is that friendship unconditional, according to Aristotle? Right? Is that goodwill extended unconditionally? Yes or no? Because a lot of people say that friendship should be unconditional. And one thing I want you to ask yourself between now and the next lecture is, does Aristotle agree? Does he think of this as an unconditional friendship? Okay, so as always, here's a quick recap. According to Aristotle, as we saw, friendship is a relationship of mutually recognized reciprocal goodwill. That's the essence of friendship. And there are three components in there, right? It has to be goodwill, the goodwill has to be reciprocal, and the reciprocal goodwill has to be mutually recognized. This kind of relationship, he says, is extended to an object on the basis of its worthiness to be loved, that is, on the basis of its goodness. And as we saw, that goodness can be intrinsic or it can be instrumental. And that can then be broken down further, such that you have friendships that are based on intrinsic goodness, the intrinsic goodness of the object, right? And that's a friendship of virtue. Or you've got friendships that are based on the instrumental goodness of the object, and that's a friendship of pleasure or utility. Okay, that's it for today. We'll pick this up next time. Bye.